So, in addition to Baron von Steuben, Marquis de Lafayette also was present at Valley Forge and was a great asset to the United States military during this time period. He was one of the people that Silas Deane recruited to come over and convinced to come over. And he was a typical French aristocrat businessman in the military since age 13, and as a young 18, 19-year-old kid looking to make a name for himself, doing something um, in the war for independence. And so when he heard about the American cause, he had read a lot of John Locke. He had read the Declaration of Independence. He strongly believed in the ideas of the Enlightenment and the rights of man and, democratic government and those sorts of things. And so he came over to the United States, and he was a Freemason, so that got him in with a lot of people like George Washington and some of the men who were in power at the time, and got him a commission in the army. And so he eventually served as a major general in the U.S. Army. He commanded some troops in New Jersey and Virginia, in some particularly great moments at the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Morristown and the Battle of Yorktown, which we'll talk about later. And he also was responsible for helping train the United States military and was also present during Valley Forge. So when we look at Valley Forge as a critical moment, we talked about von Steuben getting the permission of George Washington to train the military. And that's really what was important at Valley Forge. We read a lot about, like in building an army, about the deprivation and the starvation and, the cold winter and that sort of thing, which was a real thing. But that was happening, with armies camped everywhere around the world at this time. What really was important about Valley Forge was two things. First, it was the training of the military. Baron von Steuben took 100 men, and even though he only spoke German, he had a translator. Through his translator, he taught these 100 men basic military drill and strategy, and he had them drilling throughout the day, which is something that the United States military didn't do. And he took these 100 men, taught them how to fire 3 shots out of their musket in a minute. He taught them how to do flanking maneuvers and how to do defensive maneuvers and how to retreat to a better position and all those things that an army, a professional army, needs to do. And then he took those 100 men and he gave them their own company and had them train 100 men. And through that process at Valley Forge, the entire army got trained. And they learned, what you were supposed to do as a soldier from the Prussian point of view, but a very successful Prussian point of view. The other thing that happened at Valley Forge that was really important was counterintelligence. George Washington knew that the popularity of the war was starting to fade, and that Congress was kind of questioning how much money they should spend, as well as France. So what Washington did was brilliant. He wrote a lot of letters to Congress, and he's flat out lied to them. And he also wrote a lot of letters that he knew the British were going to intercept and read. And he made the situation at Valley Forge sound even more desperate than it was. He made it sound as if soldiers were dropping dead left and right, and it was so dark and gray that they weren't going to make it out of here. That's one of the reasons why the British never attacked at Valley Forge, because Washington kind of set the precedent. We're going to fight in the winter. The British didn't do it because they thought, what, their army's so weak it doesn't really matter. If they survive the winter, when they come out of it, they're not going to be very strong at all. It also helped get some more money from France and from Continental Congress. When they read Washington's letters, they tried harder to get more money and provisions for the army when they came out of Valley Forge. So those are really the two things that made Valley Forge this critical moment. The United States comes out of this as a trained military force, and Washington runs his counterintelligence. And it works because just after 1777, if we go back to the previous map, in the spring of 1778, General Howe is replaced by General Clinton from the British, and the British moved from Philadelphia, and they decided to go back to New York and try to consolidate their force there and figure out what they're going to do. And on their march up to New York, Washington in the spring of 1778 decides, we're going to intercept them on their way back to New York, and they fight a battle up here in Morristown. And the United States won that battle, and they won it in traditional military um, strategy. They didn't surprise anyone. They didn't get lucky. They didn't cheat. If you look at the earlier battles, they actually stood there and fought the British in open battle. And so that kind of showed that the soldiers like, hey, this training thing actually works. And as that victory sort of became well known, then people started to trust in the training process that von Steuben set up. Baron von Steuben also created the first military training manual for the United States and became the basis for the U.S. training manual. So he plays an important role in U.S. military history. So moving on, we'll start talking about the Southern Campaign and war in the South. So as I said, in 1778, Great Britain kind of abandoned their New England campaign, and they consolidated all their forces here in New York City. And the new General Clinton decided that he was going to focus his war on the South because that's where there was strong loyalist support and there wasn't as much of a patriot uprising. So he thought if they could control the war in the South, that perhaps that they could control this and then move forward and end the war that way. So he dispatched Lord Cornwallis, General Lord Cornwallis, in 1778 to the South to conquer the South. And he arrived in Charlestown and took that very large, important port pretty easily in South Carolina. There was only a few thousand-man force in the way. And then at the Battle of later on in the battles of Savannah and Camden, Cornwallis would end up capturing most of the army in the South. So it was really left up to the militia in the South to fight Cornwallis. There was only about 2,000 regular United States Army left, and the rest of the 5,000 men that were fighting against Cornwallis in the South were of the militia, which meant they were citizen soldiers. They weren't professional soldiers. They were guys with guns that knew how to shoot and had very limited training. So in the South, Southerners decided to take a different approach to fighting the British. Rather than try to line up on a battlefield and fight them, as they were doing in the North as regular soldiers, they decided to take up guerrilla warfare. And that was a little more successful, and we'll talk about that in a second. It was successful at the Battle of the Cowpens, where the United States tricked Great Britain and made them believe they were retreating, but they really weren't. And they drew the British in to a trap and ended up winning an important battle and capturing a lot of British soldiers. They won another battle at the Battle of Kings Mountain in similar fashion. The British won an important battle at Guilford's courthouse, but the fact that the British spent so much time in the South here, it was almost 1780 by the time Cornwallis started to make his way into Virginia, that the French were starting to arrive, and French money and French soldiers were starting to make a difference. And then finally, in 1780, Cornwallis made his way into Yorktown, Virginia, where he encamped himself. And with the help of the French, George Washington decided to abandon his defense of Philadelphia and New York City and march his army on Cornwallis in Yorktown. And a siege, a long, drawn-out battle ensued in Yorktown between the American soldiers and the British. And with the help of the French army, this boat over here was supposed to sail in, but it didn't. Anyway, with the help of the French army and French Navy, the United States was able to win a key battle at Yorktown, which eventually would help force the end of the American Revolution. So let's talk a little bit about guerrilla warfare in the South, because it was a bit different than what was going on in the North. In New England and in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Washington and his army was trying to fight traditional warfare, where they line up and they shoot at each other. In the South, however, the military adopted this guerrilla warfare, and it's really hit and run. You can see here over by the picture, men hiding in woods and attacking the British, and sort of not necessarily to capture them or give them a devastating loss, but more to be a nuisance. Pick off a couple men here and there, disrupt their supply lines so their army couldn't get the necessary bullets or food or clothes that they needed, and just generally harassing the British. And it was successful enough in the South that it slowed British war plans down to allow the French to get more involved
and to allow Washington to have more time to train his army and recruit more soldiers and build the army up. That by 1780, when we get back to that Battle of Yorktown, Cornwallis's troops were worn out, they were tired, they were frustrated, and which is one of the reasons why he encamped himself in Yorktown. And then with the help of the French Navy and Washington's forces there, they were able to deal this very significant blow to the British, which would eventually help force peace in 1783. So, so when we look at the war in the North and the South, there's kind of fought in two different ways, with traditional warfare in the North and then guerrilla warfare in the South. And we're going to take a look at this when we watch the film The Patriot and kind of see how that played out. But in general, when we look at the United States and how they were able to win this war, we know they were up against significant challenges, particularly recruiting the army, paying for the army, and keeping it. But there were several really important key things that helped them win. You had the French alliance. You had the training of the military by Steuben and Lafayette, and then there was a decision to adopt guerrilla warfare in the South. And I think those are really two things that were able to help the United States overcome and win the war. So what I want you to do is take a moment and look back at these two lectures and reflect a little bit on what we talked about and the course of the war and how it played out. And then on the link to the Google form that's attached, I want you to answer this question: how was America able to win the war, despite these challenges? And give some examples based on the lecture and what you may have read. When you're finished with that, if there is still some time in class, take a look at your basic knowledge sheet. Take the time to fill in some information, either from this lecture or from the text related to that. And by now, you should have absolutely have read through section 3, 6.3 of the text at minimum. So you can go ahead and get started on that if you haven't done that yet. All right, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.